Welcome back to the Linux Academy Nginx Deep Dive. In this video, we're going to continue working with the Node.js applications that we set up in the previous video to look at how we can proxy to these servers. This is a photo application, and we're going to set this up using the subdomain off of example.com of photos.example.com. And the main module that we're going to be working with today is going to be the HTTP proxy module. And this, along with two kind of companion modules that we're going to find for FastCGI and uWSGI, they all sort of have the exact same shape to them. If you kind of zoomed out and you squinted a little bit, you would see that they have roughly the exact same directives created for each of them. So we're gonna see that there's a lot of similarities here, and there are going to be things that we can do with each one of them that work almost exactly the same in the other ones. So I'm obviously not going to have time to go through and talk about every single thing we could do with the proxy module, nor the FastCGI module or the uWSGI one, but a lot of what we're going to be covering in each of them individually will be applicable to the others. When we first introduced reverse proxies, we mentioned that you could use them to direct traffic, doing some load balancing, and then you could also utilize them for caching. And we're going to do a couple different things. We want our Nginx service, so the actual Nginx server itself, is going to serve up static content because Nginx is fabulous at doing that. It is very, very performant at serving up data that it already knows, static content, that's what it can do. And then we can strategically have it route specific requests to our applications so that it can generate dynamic information, or that it can have the application handle the request and do what it needs to do, whether that be create something in the database or do some sort of calculation. It can do the dynamic work. But we can have Nginx sit in between so that our application server isn't inundated with requests and we're getting the most performance that we can. But when we're just going to set up the initial proxy server, proxy pass and the proxy pass kind of family of things here are going to be the directives that we're going to be working with. So this is going to be the main thing that we're working with right now. And then we're going to see how we can divide up some location blocks to serve different pieces of content without actually talking to the application. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm inside of etc nginx again. And from in here, we're going to create another file inside of our conf.d directory. And this is going to be for photos.example.com.conf. And this takes our standard server block that we've seen. That's going to listen on port 80. Whoops. And you could set this up with SSL if you wanted to with a self-signed certificate. That's just going to take a little bit of extra time, so we're not going to do that when we're just trying to demonstrate the fundamental features of a reverse proxy. But if you want to go that extra mile while you're following along, I encourage you to do that. And the server name is going to be photos.example.com. So now we get to think about what our location is actually going to do. We're going to set a base location block. And notice that we haven't set a root or anything yet, and that's because we aren't really serving everything from a directory. It's not like the static websites that we've been working with up to this point. We're going to be serving something that is a dynamic web application. Our web client happens to run on port 3000, so what we're going to do is we're going to set up a proxy pass. And then let's take a look at the documentation for proxy pass to see exactly how this is going to work. So proxy pass takes a URL. So that means it has to have an HTTP or HTTPS. That's one of the things about this. Proxy and the proxy module is going to be speaking HTTP. And our examples that we can see here are that it can be speaking HTTP to a server. So this is going to be something listening on a port. And this is going to require it to use its internal networking stack to kind of communicate, even though it's on the same machine. But you could also use a socket to speak to this, but you're still going to have to prefix it with your normal HTTP identifier in the beginning. And then you would just have another kind of prefix here that looks a little weird, but Unix : and then the path to the socket itself, and then you would have your kind of path to the URI. But most of the time when you're working with proxy pass, you're going to be using it just like this. You're going to have it with your HTTP or HTTPS, and then you're going to give it the URL that you want. For us, we're going to be working off of 127.0.0.1, and then we're going to give it the port for the application. So if we come back over here, that's going to be HTTP because it doesn't have its own SSL, and then 127.0.0.1, and then 3000. So technically, we could stop right there and it would reroute the traffic that comes into the actual Nginx server to the server running on port 3000. But there are some other things we're going to kind of want to do around here. And these will cover common problems that we run into while we're using Nginx as a reverse proxy, or anything really as a reverse proxy. A lot of times in your applications, you're going to want to know kind of the IP address of the client, and you might need to know some other information, or you want to make some manipulation to headers. And so that's what we're going to kind of talk about right now. We're going to go back over into the documentation, and there are a few other things we want to look at. So proxy pass was one of them. The other one I want to look at is HTTP version. So proxy_HTTP version. And we want to upgrade this. So by default, it's going to use 1.0. But we're going to eventually be able to use keep alive connections. So for that, we're going to bump it to version 1.1. So we want to have proxy HTTP version 1.1. So that's another improvement we're going to make while we're working with our reverse proxy. But the other one, and to kind of cover that IP address example that I briefly mentioned, we're going to use the proxy_set_header. And this one takes a field and a value. And these are going to be the headers that we're defining or manipulating before we pass them to the server. So this isn't a response header. This is a request header that we're setting. And if you have an application that you're proxying traffic to that is expecting some very specific things in the headers, you can use your Nginx configuration as a place to add new information through headers or to modify things based off of the variables that we have in Nginx. So one of the standard ones, and to actually look at the entire chain of proxying that there could potentially be, is we can use proxy, set header, and then kind of a standard extra header. These are going to start with X's. It'll be X-forwarded 4. And then Nginx provides us with a variable that is proxy add X forwarded 4. And what this will do, if we go look this up, is it will essentially create a string that is a chain of IP addresses, starting with the real IP of the client, and then going through the various IP addresses of the proxy servers that might have ended up in this. So it'll take the X forwarded 4 from the previous proxy, and it will append its own information to that. And if there is no previous proxy, it'll just take the IP address that it had. We're going to set a field that is just the first part of that. That's going to be proxy set header. This is going to be X real IP. Then we'll set this to remote address or adder. A few other headers we're going to set here are going to be related to what would happen if we had this Node.js that was working with WebSockets. This is something that's kind of common if you're working with Node.js applications, as they occasionally work with WebSockets. And some of the things we could do there is there's going to be an upgrade header that we can set to HTTP upgrade. And then additionally, there's going to be a proxy set header of connection that we can just set to upgrade. There's really not any penalty to doing this. So if we have an application that we know might need to use WebSockets, this is one thing that we can kind of just do and feel okay about it here. So we're going to set these headers, and there's a lot of potential headers you can work with in HTTP, and there's not really a situation where we could cover all of them because not all of them are useful all the time, and it's something that is better to kind of gradually learn them as you go. But these are some common things you might look forward to, and specifically the X forwarded 4 is probably one of the biggest headaches that people run into when they start using Nginx as a reverse proxy, is they need to get the actual IP address of the client, and instead their logs on their application servers just repeatedly show the same IP address because they're seeing the IP address of their client, which is the proxy server itself. Let's save this, and we will check to make sure we didn't have any typos, and it looks like we're okay. Let's systemctl reload Nginx, and then we'll use curl, once again, with a header and a host of photos.example.com to localhost. And we get a 502. So 502s, this is going to be one of those things we run into fairly frequently. If we're using a system that is running SE Linux, this means that we have some sort of permissions error somewhere with Nginx. We can take a look at this by doing a less on var log Nginx error. then go into the bottom. And it looks like it is not allowed to connect to the upstream. So it's not allowed to use the network. And to get around this, we can use set se bool. And then this will be HTTPD can network connect to be 1. Then we can try this again. So now if we curl, we see that it's actually going off and hitting something, and we don't exactly know what this looks like just yet because we haven't looked at it in the browser. But that's the next thing that we're going to cover. We've been using example.com domains because nobody really owns example.com, and it's one that's used for testing purposes like this. So what we have to do in order to actually go and look at a website that we're using example.com for is we're going to have to modify our Etsy host file. But we can't modify the Etsy host file of the actual server that we're on because we need to connect to it through a web browser. So what we actually have to do is we have to open up a terminal. And from here, we have to open up Etsy hosts. And we're just going to add it on to this list. And we need to grab the IP address that we have. So in this case, I'm going to look at my cloud server here. Copy this IP address. And we will paste that in here. We will paste this in here. And then we will set this to photo.example.com. And we'll save it. Now, if we come back to our browser and we try to go to photos.example.com, we can see that it actually went off and it did hit our Linux Academy Cloud Assessments demo application. One of the things that I like to make sure when we're looking at this is that everything actually went all right. So for that, we're going to look at Inspect Element. And in these developer tools here, the one that we really care about is going to be the Network tab. So I like to open up Network and then refresh the page so I can see all of the requests that are made and I can see what the status of those requests are. And I'm going to disable the cache just so it doesn't try to do that. And you can see that everything successfully got requested. Even this file select.js was picked up correctly, but that's one of those things that means that we routed traffic to our proxy server to serve a static asset that it was going to be using. Let's see what we can do to utilize the strengths of Nginx to not have to rely on the application server to serve up static content itself. So coming back to our web browser that is connected to our cloud server, we're going to go back into the configuration for our photos. And we're going to come down and add another location block. And this one is going to use a different type of matching that we haven't done thus far. And it's going to be a case-insensitive regular expression. So that's what if you see just the tilde by itself, that's a regular expression, but that is case sensitive. But if you see tilde with an asterisk by it, that means it's going to match on the regular expression, but it doesn't care if it's using capital or lowercase letters. So for this one, we want to match anything that has an actual period and then either JavaScript, CSS, PNG, JPEG, and that's the E is optional there, so we can put the question mark in there to say that. So that'll match JPG and JPEG. And then GIF. So this matches CSS files, JavaScript files, and the common image formats that we're going to see. And then we can go in here, and this is where we're going to set the root of just things that match this location block to var www photos.example.com. And we need to make this directory. So rather than making that directory new, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a symbolic link between srv www photo app apps web client, and then this is going to be the public directory. We're going to set this directory over to be var www photos.example.com. And now if we look inside of var www photos.example.com, we'll see that there's a JavaScript directory, and then inside of that, there would be that file select. We're going to go ahead and do a restore on the things inside of var www. And we'll make this verbose just because I'm kind of assuming we're going to run into issues. Oddly, nothing changed there. So let's reload Nginx. So we'll do system ctl reload Nginx. And then when we go and actually look in our web browser at our example application, make sure to check disable cache because we want to make sure it's trying to hit the right thing. And then when we go and do this, we're going to see that we're getting 403s for our file select file. And that means that it's attempting to use the new Nginx location block, but it's getting a 403, and these permission errors are undoubtedly almost always SE Linux in our experience. So if we go back over here, we might need to actually just add a new condition for our SRV wwws. And what we're going to do here is we're going to do se manage, then we'll make another file context. It's going to have a type of httpd sys content t. And then we'll just make this to where it'll basically work for any time there's a public directory inside of srv www. So we'll set it to srv www dot asterisk public, and then we will add an optional slash and anything trailing that, and then we'll end that string. So with that set up, we'll do the restore connection on srv www, and we'll see what kind of change that makes. Goes off and makes a lot of modifications to things inside of there. And with any luck, when we go back over and take a look at this page, refreshing it, we see that we get all 200s. So that's kind of an indication to me that symbolic links didn't work exactly the way I wanted them to, but Nginx doesn't need to know that. Nginx just needs to know that it's looking inside of var www, so that's us being consistent across the various applications that we're working with. It's our job to understand the potential weirdness that you can run into with SE Linux. So now that we've successfully set up the reverse proxy, we can actually use this application, which we haven't done yet. Let's reopen that just to see if anything happens while we're using this. But the way it works is you browse to a file. I'm going to look inside my pictures directory, and I have a small file that I want to use. And I'm going to submit this. It went off and it uploaded the file, and it actually grayscaled it. So we might have seen that it was an orange background before, and it went off and put it into S3, did some modifications to it, and then served that up directly. This, if we inspect this particular element itself, we can see that the URL here for the source is coming out of S3 directly. It's not actually being served up through Nginx. So this isn't actually putting any stress onto our server. This is what the photo storage application is going off and fetching. It's returning some information before our client application is building the HTML. But the other thing I wanted to kind of demonstrate is what happens if there is a larger file. So if we put a larger file in here, so this is something over a megabyte in size, and we submit this, we're going to see 413 request entity too large. So this is coming from Nginx itself. It's giving us a 413 error, which is kind of a weird one, but we have a request entity that is too large. Just means we tried to submit a file that was a little bit too big. Since we had a sample application that was working with photos and that kind of larger piece of information, I figured this was a good time for us to talk about what can be sent to Nginx and how to get around this. Specifically, what we would do to fix this is we'll come up to the top of the documentation, and just to make it a little bit easier for us to find this, we'll look at the directives. But what we want is going to be the client max body size. And this, if we see here, is how we get around the 413 request entity too large. So we have to set this, and it's by default 1 megabyte. So if we want to set this to something else so we can accept larger images, then we're going to want to make a modification there. To do this, we're going to come in and modify our conf.d photos examples. And in this one, it goes just in the server block by itself. We can check to make sure that it can go in the HTTP section, the server, or the location. We're just going to put it in the server in its entirety here. And for this, we're going to have client max body size of, we'll just set it to 5 megabytes and save. We'll reload Nginx. And then we will come back over into our page here. And we're going to try this again. So we'll browse to our large file, submit this. And now we can see that we have 2 different size pictures of my face, apparently. But we can handle larger files. So that is not actually related to us proxying applications, but it is something that we were uniquely suited to learn about while we were working with photos. So the client max body size is a good one to actually keep in mind. But if you're searching through the documentation, it's good to know what the HTTP status code is, because if it's very specific, then sometimes you can find helpful information about the directives that you're going to need in order to fix it by searching for that very specific number. Let's take one last look at our configuration for our photos. And the bulk of what we wanted to learn here was about proxy pass and the proxy module and the various things that we could do. We covered a couple of extra headers that you can send to the application if you need more information in the application itself. But the bulk of the way we are going to use proxy is going to be through proxy pass, HTTP, and then the destination server and port. And this could be on a completely different machine. You can do this through a private network if you have that set up. And then as long as it's something that can communicate HTTP, you'll be good to go in this particular proxy setup. In the next video, or in the next couple videos really, we're going to be looking at how we can proxy not speaking HTTP. We're going to use 2 different binary protocols. One is UWSGI and the other one is FastCGI. These are 2 protocols that are used with relatively common, actually extremely common web platforms such as PHP and Python, and UWSGI can work beyond just Python, but those are going to be our 2 examples, because speaking HTTP to our proxied applications is great, but doing this requires us to invoke the network stack. And so if we want to speak over a socket, sometimes it's better to just speak in a different protocol, even though Nginx is still going to speak HTTP to the end user. So that's something we're going to look at in the next handful of videos.